Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Herzlich tut mich verlangen, which translates to my heart is filled with a longing. I think we've looked at this text setting before, but this melody, or not necessarily the melody, but this particular harmonization is new and is very fascinating and has a lot of interesting stuff going on from the chord that we start with to the chord that we end with. So there's lots to talk about with this chorale, lots of analytical ambiguity. Very excited to get into this video. So no key signature to start things off. We start on E minor and we end on E major, interestingly enough. But I think what's even more interesting is that I'm making the argument that we start in the key of C major, and we are seeing an unprecedented, at least as far as this analysis is concerned, or at least as far as my analysis up until this point has been concerned, we've never started on a 3 chord. So that's the argument that I'm making. This chorale definitely has some modal overtones going on. I know the word overtones has musical implications or sound implications as well, but it definitely has a modal sound to it, even though you can analyze it in a harmonically functional fashion. But we start off with E minor. This B is a chord tone, and then we have F, A, E, and A. And if we lump in together this C right here, even though we get a D happening at the same time, we can make the argument that this is F major 7, just incomplete. We don't have the C happening on the downbeat, but we do have it happening within the span of the 2 eighth notes that occupy beat 1. You could also make the argument that this is D, F, C, and A, which is D minor 7 chord in first inversion. I think both of them are valid. I think one is equal to the other depending on how you look at it, but I'm going to just call it an F major 7 chord because that's how I hear it when I listen back to the progression. If you hear it differently, you hear it like a 2-6-5, that's fine because they're both functioning the same way. We then have G, B, D, and G. That's G major in root position, which is our dominant. It's a 5 chord. And then we have A, D, A, C, D, and F, which is D minor 7 over A, so that is a 2-4-3 chord. You could make the argument that these two tones are accented non-chord tones that are preceding the chord tones that are happening on beat 3 but I think there's a progression going on here because 2 wants to go to the chord that's created by these two voices switching up. We have B, G, D, and F. That's G7 over B, which is 5-6-5. And then we go to C, G, C, and E, our 2-5-1 progression in the key of C major, our root position tonic triad. We have a passing 7th in the alto as well. Before we get F, A, and D, which is D minor in first inversion, that's 2-6. This F is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. However, I think we're moving towards the key of A minor here, and this is now 4-6. So this D, F, A, and D is also happening at the same, we have the same chord happening on beat 2 of this measure as well, because 3 of the voices are static and the tenor has this moving line, which just contributes more chord tones to this D minor triad over F. We then have E, B, B, and E, and I hear these two chords like it's almost as if Bach is slowing the harmonic rhythm down here to beats 1 and 3 rather than introducing a chord on every beat, because here we have E, B, B, and E, which is implying, I would imagine, E major. We don't know if it's E major or E minor yet. We see both of them used in the context of A minor throughout the chorale. However, I'm going to assume that it's E major because the G sharp gets introduced on beat 4. So if we lump these two chords together, this open 5th and this E major triad, we get E major because you add up all the unique tones and you get E major. And I apologize, this is not a B, this is a D. So this would be like a thirdless 5-7 chord, like a E7 without the G sharp, but the G sharp gets introduced here, And then I guess we could change the figure bass just to be 8, 5, 3. I guess that would be reversing the, or undoing the 7. We then have A minor, A, E, and C, which is our tonic triad and root position. We have a passing 7th on the bass before we get F, A, F, and C, another F major triad. This time it is 6, our submediate and root position. This C is a chord tone, this E is a passing 7th. We then get D, D, F, and B, which is B diminished over D, and in the key of A minor, that is 2, 6. 6 wants to go to 2, so that's a good sign. We also have B and D happening here, and those are both chord tones, but it's kind of like the B diminished triads being put in root position here, so I'm going to change the figure bass because it's interesting to see Bach move 2 voices to compensate for what would be removed from the chord on the and, which he often does. But here we have a completely voiced triad as a result of the voices moving, so I'm going to mark the change in figured bass. And then we go to E, G, natural, E, and B. So we have 2, 6 going to 5 natural, and this really gives it the modal sound. I mean, there are other things that you can make an argument about. You could say we're in E Phrygian at the beginning of the chorale here, E going to F natural. That's definitely what it sounds like on first listen, even though the result or the trajectory of the progression is definitely C major in my ears. But here we have a 2, 6 going to a 5 natural chord, which is very interesting. We have 2 passing tones. One of them is a passing 7th. That is the one in the alto. And then we have a passing tone in the tenor as well before we get a major. It has a very like Phrygian dominant sound, which is interesting. But I do think this is a dominant, or sorry, not a, well, I do think it's a dominant as well, but I think this is a major tonic that's also functioning like a dominant, a secondary dominant as well, because if we look at the chord tones that we have happening up until the repeat, we do have A major going to sort of a D minor sound. We have the F and the D introduced, so what's happening here is like 4, 6, 4 because they share a bass. So I guess you could make the argument that this A chord is 5 of 4 as well, and it sort of continues this idea of this 4, 6, 4 chord, this C being a non-chord tone, this G being a non-chord tone. I think we are looping back to the key of C here, and we're going to call this 2, 6, 4. I don't know how important the bass is in terms of labeling this chord. It is kind of a pedal tone, so whether the 6, 4 is implied is up to you and how granular you want to be. But we have this idea that also appears later on of adjacent harmony, these long strings of progressions that consist of chords that are next to one another in the scale. So 2, 3, 4, 5. In this case would be an example of that. We see something to a similar degree later in the chorale, so I feel like this is the first instance of that, and it's a byproduct of the repeat, so it's like a very cyclical phrase. It's not just a repeat, it's like, notice how there are no fermatas separating the phrases, there are no cadences in this, or no deliberate fermated cadences in this particular chorale until we get to the end, even though there are some more deliberate ones in the B section here. They're a little less, obvious, but here we have some type of authentic cadence. I think that it's an imperfect authentic cadence because we don't have really any leading tone action. Minor 5 is a very stable chord. It doesn't really have that tendency to want to resolve to the tonic with the same sense of urgency that 5 major does. So I don't know if it's imperfect authentic or if it's perfect authentic, because it doesn't specify in the definition whether it has to be a major dominant going to our tonic, but I feel like the leading tone is just as integral of a tone in the dominant, maybe even more important than the root of the chord, just because of the function that the chord holds traditionally. So I think it's up to you in terms of how you want to decide, but this is definitely an incredibly unusual chorale, erring on more of like the modal side of things in terms of the way that it sounds. We have to sort of stretch our tonal vocabulary to try and fit it into that tonal narrative, because it's definitely a merging of sound worlds where we have this sort of modal sound and tonal vocabulary. So looking ahead, I think we have a kind of a faux cadence here. I'm going to call it a perfect authentic cadence that happens on the downbeat. Here there's no fermata, and one of my biggest pet peeves is when the score has the end of a phrase at the beginning of a new system, but there's no fermata there, so there's a continuous flow, even though functionally there feels like there is a cadence happening here. So this A minor triad we have here, A, E, A, and C, that is a minor tonic that I think is also being repurposed as our submediant in the key of C major. We have a passing seventh in the alto before we get D, D, F, and B. That's a B diminished over D, or 7/6. That's our leading tone chord. That C is a very brief passing tone before we get C major, or sorry, E, D, E, and G. Oh no, that is a C major chord. I think this D is kind of like a 7/6 suspension over the bass, especially because it's being repeated from the previous D in the tenor. So I do think this is a tonic triad in first inversion. I guess you could make the argument that it is a 3/7 chord if you literally look on the downbeat, but I think this is pretty clear that that is a suspension. We then have F, C, E, and A, another F major 7 chord, which is 4/7 in the key of C. The C is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we have D, D, F, and B. Again, another B diminished triad in first inversion. And 4 wants to go to 7, so that's a good sign. And then we have C major, C, G, G, and C. This open fifth has been a very widely used tool in this particular chorale. It's also something that's a very old world sound. It's like an early music sound where composers would cadence on the open fifth because of the purity of the interval. It wasn't until later in the Renaissance, if I can remember from my survey class, that the third got introduced as more of a commonplace interval in cadential situations. The open fifth was preferred for a very long time, especially very early music like medieval music. The fifths are their bread and butter because of the purity of the interval. But still, we know that a tonic triad's being implied here. It'd be very interesting if he introduced a minor triad here. Looking ahead, we have kind of a short phrase where we have probably the most deliberate cadence outside of the one at the end of the chorale, but we technically have a bit of a half cadence being implied here in the key of D minor, or at least I hear it in the key of D minor. This A is a passing tone, this B is a passing seventh, this F is a passing tone, and then we get C major again, C, C, E, and C, which is C major in root position, and then we get E, C, C, and G, which is C major in first inversion, so we'll just change the figured bass there, and then we get F major, F, F, C, and A, which is a 4 chord in root position. It also happens to be our 3 chord in the key of D major, and then we get C natural, G, C, and C. So we have another open fifth, which is very interesting, but this C is technically not a non-chord tone, but it's like a weird kind of like 8/7 suspension over the bass because the B flat is the chord tone it's the tone that's telling us exactly what's going on here, because the C is not how do I want to say that? The B flat makes me feel like we've already modulated before because it's an integral tone in the key of D minor, as well as the C sharp that's happening here in the bass. And when we see chromatic bass lines, especially in the chorales, we know that the chord progressions kind of push the definition of normative chord progressions that we see. So the C major triad, I'm going to call it 7. We can call it 7/7 technically speaking. And that's eventually going to go to C sharp, E, A, and A, which is A major in first inversion. That is 5/6. So 7 going to 5 is kind of an interesting progression because they both have tonic resolution qualities. Even subtonic 7th wants to go to 1 to a certain degree. It wants to go to 3 even more because it is its dominant. The fact that it's being preceded by the chord it wants to resolve to means that there's a transitive progression going on. There's a lot of wacky things going on here. This progression's almost like it's backwards, or definitely the fact that it's being like cleaved into like the 3 and the 7 kind of feels like a separate idea from this 5 chord, or at least that's the way that I hear it. But The 5 chord does resolve the way that we would expect it to. It does go to D minor, D, F, A, and F, our tonic triad, passing tone in the tenor before we get an open fifth, A, E, and E. And I think we know that 5 is being implied here, but I think there's intention behind why Bach is using an open fifth here rather than a major triad. So it feels like a half cadence in terms of the way that it sounds, but the fact that it's missing the leading tone in the key of D minor means that the chord afterwards feels like a little bit more of a natural transition. We could make the argument that because there is no fifth, there might be a bit of an optional or a different take on this chord right here. We could say that it is also in the key of A minor, our tonic, because it's ambiguous. It's an androgynous chord. It has no C sharp. We don't know whether or not the quality of the chord is major or minor. So I think one possible analysis is saying that we are moving to the key of A minor via this ambiguous chord because we don't know. It's functioning as both major and minor at the same time. But I kind of hear this more as an what's the word? Oh god, I'm forgetting what it's called. Not an abrupt. A direct modulation. A, E, and C. That's what it sounds like more to me. I feel like this is how it's functioning, and the role of these open fifths, we have to sort of look past the fact that they are androgynous due to the lack of the third, and look at them for what's being implied for analytical purposes, because we've seen cadences or chords that sort of serve like a cadence or a cadential purpose without being a traditional cadence like we would expect using the fermata. They're operating with an open fifth, even though we kind of know what's being implied. So we have to look between the lines there. But I think we stay in the key of A minor for the rest of the chorale. We go from one open fifth to another open fifth, E, B, E, and B. And we don't know whether or not this is minor 5, but chances are in a minor chorale we're implying a major 5. So I'll leave both analyses there, but we don't know. And then we have another interesting situation here. We have the flip side of the coin. For major and minor triads, we need the third of the chord in order to know the quality because they both share a fifth in common. For minor and diminished chords, the only difference between them is the quality of the fifth. Minor triads have a perfect fifth. Diminished triads have a diminished fifth, which is where their names come from. We have B, B, D, and D. So we have this idea of two-note chords, like we can use inference and our understanding of how tonal harmony works to infer what's going on here. So I think that this is 5 going to be diminished, but we don't know if it's B minor as well. This could be a harmonization of the melodic minor scale if we were to introduce F sharp, or sorry, not F, yeah, if we were to introduce F sharp somewhere, which would change the quality of our supertonic from diminished to minor in a minor key. And then we have this very interesting ascending line, and this begins the adjacent harmonic progression that we saw at the beginning if we include the tail end of the phrase, the 2, 3, 4, 5. And this progression goes even a step further by harmonizing the scale up to 6, because these are all root position triads the way that I see them. So here we have E, B, E, and C, or sorry, C, B, E, and C. I see that as C major 7, that is a 3 chord, and it has a 7th, so 3, 7. This D is a passing tone, this A is a passing tone, this F sharp is a passing tone, and this C is a chord tone. This would be D7 in root position. That would be uppercase 4, 7 in the key of A minor, and that goes to E minor, E, E, G natural, and B, which is a 5 chord. But that 5 chord is quickly turned into major, at least in terms of its foundational triad, on the next 8th note, where we have a passing chromatic G sharp and a passing 7th in the tenor, which spells E, D, G sharp, and B, which is E7 in root position. So we can make it uppercase and we can add a 7th there. And that goes to F major, so we have a bit of a deceptive progression. F sharp, C, A, and A, which is our submediate F major. And this C sharp here, this C sharp kind of complicates things because I think it's just an expressive tone, because it sort of it brings into the into the fray this idea of the leading tone going to this D minor chord here, right? Because we have F, D, A, and A, which is like a 4-6 chord, and this C sharp is connecting the it's connecting the subtonic seventh and the tonic if we're thinking in terms of D minor. But technically what's going on here is a D minor chord in first inversion, and the C sharp is just an expressive tone connecting the C and the D. It very well didn't need to be there, but the tenors had a very active lineup until this point. Maybe he's just continuing the flow, or he's just mirroring what had been done in the alto previously. But interestingly, following this D minor triad, we have E, G, E, and B, which is a minor 5 chord. And actually, let me double check and see if that is right. I do believe that that is the case. It is an E minor triad, which is a minor 5 chord, and we've seen a lot of minor 5 chords in this particular chorale. It definitely gives it more of a Renaissance early music sound. But 4 going to 5, it's a very stable progression. It's interesting. It introduces the idea of the dominant without really creating a sense of urgent resolution, and that's kind of justified by the fact that we have A, E, and E, another open fifth that we have to sort of look past and add the C sharp and the G that happens on the next beat, which would fully voice an A7 chord, which would be a secondary dominant in this case, 5-7 of 4. So the fact that E minor is going to A7, I think it's interesting because we can look at this progression right here in the key of D minor. We can call it 1-6 going to 2, going to 5-7, going to 1, even though I don't really think there is compelling enough of a reason, especially having all of these contextual chords in the key of A minor, this long chromatic build-up to A minor, to the makings of an A minor triad, but we actually get F major, a deceptive progression. But all these contextual chords that strengthen the A minor analysis, this progression right here does bring a lot of attention to D minor without, I think, ever really leaving the key. And this, I think, to truly be in the key of D minor, this would need to be a B flat. But because the tone that would change this from minor to diminished is in the melody, Bach has to make concessions. And this chorale has already pushed, I think, his chorale vocabulary to its limit. It's one of those chorales. The majority of the chorales we've looked at so far are relatively tame in comparison to this one. This is definitely an outlier and feels a lot more, I don't want to say mature, because I feel like even his more reserved, less reserved, I think that's a better way to say it. Like even his more reserved chorales feel mature, less reserved, and definitely more experimental in terms of the approach he takes. This definitely doesn't fit the tonal scheme that you would use to describe Bach's harmonic vocabulary as a whole, but he definitely pushes that limit in this chorale. But the 5-7 of 4 does resolve where we expect it to, D, F, A, and D, which is D minor in root position. We also have some passing tones in the inner voices before we get A, C, and E, tonic triad, root position, A minor. Passing seventh in the bass before we get F, A, D, and D, which is D minor in first inversion, 2-6, and then we have this idea of the chromatic passing tone going on. And if we look at this note, it kind of it makes a little bit more sense of the progression that ends the chorale, which is very fascinating. Here we have F sharp, A, D, and D, which would turn it into D major, and that would imply 5-6 of 7. And I feel like we've seen a 5 of 7 chord maybe once or twice in the chorales up until this point. I'd have to go back through my notes, but it isn't ringing any bells. Typically when you see 5-6 of 7, you've usually like modulated, I feel like, because tonicizing the subtonic seventh is not something that happens all that often, but you could make the argument that that's happening there. That's why I put it in parentheses. I feel like it's just a passing tone in the same way that this C sharp is a passing tone. I don't think this F major chord is turning into F augmented and then going to D minor. But I feel like there's a stronger argument to say that this chord is a little bit more justified than if we were to try and forge a chord out of the notes that are happening at the same time as this C sharp is introduced. But G major happens afterwards, G, B, D, and G with the passing tone in the alto, which does mark a 7 chord, so it does resolve where, hypothetically speaking, it should. So maybe that is the chord that's being implied there, and it's just a happy coincidence that that F sharp does change the fundamental quality of the triad, and its function is seen to fruition. And then our final chord, which is this interesting progression again that we've seen in the past with this chromatic half step in the bass. We have G natural going to G sharp. We have E major over G sharp, which is a 5/6 chord. And we have this long sort of cadence where the E is sustained, and then we have the end of the cadence happening here, which still fills the E major sound quota that is being introduced on the downbeat of this cadential measure. So I've seen this progression of 7 going to 5 before. It's kind of foreshadowing what's happening here, kind of making normal what progression is typically unusual. So E7, this G sharp is a chord tone. We have A, E, B, and E. I think this B is like it's like a 9/8 suspension over the bass that does get resolved too. C does get introduced at the same time, or it doesn't get introduced at the same time, but it does get introduced over the course of this whole beat, so I do feel like one is being implied here. So this B is also a non-chord tone, but as we know, Bach gets very contrapuntal, typically in his cadences, so sometimes we have to read between the lines in order to get the harmony that's being implied, but one does go to 5, E, B, B, and E, and fittingly to close out this chorale, he cadences on an open 5th, which is very interesting, and I think a half cadence is the most fitting label to call this cadence because we are cadencing on the dominant despite the G sharp not being present on the final sonority, and that's going to cap off episode 200 of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. This is a super fascinating chorale to have as the subject matter of episode 200. I can't believe that we are in the 200s. It's pretty incredible. I'm really excited that this journey is, still causing me a lot of joy and still a really fun, exciting part of my day, and that I've stuck it out so far. I'm really excited. This chorale is filled with twists and turns and lots of ambiguity and uncertainty. I think that my analysis here is succinct and grounded in like logic and reasoning, but I think there are lots of different ways for anyone to go about looking at this particular chorale, and in lots of other chorales that I've looked at in the past and in general. So with this particular chorale, if anyone has any alternative stances on it or any differing viewpoints, I'd be really fascinated to see how you look at this chorale. And if you want to share it in the comments section or send me a private message, that would be awesome, so we could have a discussion about it, because this chorale stands amongst the top in terms of ones that stand out and are very interesting. And where do we cross the line between modality and tonality? I analyzed this chorale in a very tonal, relatively strict fashion in terms of the stance that I took. I didn't really broaden my viewpoint to include modal possibilities, but I did try to leave wiggle room for what chords could be interpreted where and how the progression changed within the tonal bounds. But on that note, if you're interested in following me along on this journey to analyze all the chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification icon. You'll be notified of when my daily video goes live, and it will hopefully get you your daily fix of Bach and your daily dose of analysis. So I would love to have you along on the journey. But other than that, thank you so much for I would love if you subscribe to the channel, but thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you so much for supporting the channel by doing so, and I look forward to tomorrow's analysis. I hope you take care.